Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Pais.
And today we're talking about fixations, the fixation of each Enneagram type, which we'll define in a moment.
At last, because I think people just mention that at times on the Enneagram community, and it's so central.
So just like the passions are the core of the emotional center, the lower emotional center of our personality, fixations are kind of the core of the mental center. They're a core pattern or belief or worldview that structures the way each type sees things from a mental perspective.
Yeah, and because both centers are equally important when it comes to inner work, we need to work on both. Fixations are not less important than passions.
Of course not.
Yeah, and also there is a lot of confusion out there in terms of what comes from each of these two parts of the personality structure. What tendencies for each of the 9 types come from the fixation and which ones come from the passion. And it's super important to tell the difference because the approach to working on those things changes drastically.
Right. And also the way you focus on something is in large measure determined on how you understand it and where it comes from and what it's about.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's good if we say a little bit more to define the fixation, what it is, how it operates, why it's so central, before we maybe talk about the fixations of the 9 types.
Okay.
So what would you say to help people understand what is the fixation? And again, this comes from the teaching, the modern teaching of the Enneagram that started with Oscar Ichazo in the modern era around the 60s and 70s. He defined the types in terms of passions and fixations, and they're the central core of what we need to work on in different ways. And when we can focus on what's core, then I think we get a lot done. We're more efficient in our Enneagram work. But what would you say to sort of help people really understand in a clear way what the fixation is, how it operates, and then maybe how to work on it?
Right. I think there are quite a few things to be said, and all of them important. So this may take a while, but I hope it will be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
First thing, B, is those two centers need to be operated and be used wisely. And when we are stuck in personality, we do everything but wisely use of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, the passion occupies a big part of the emotional experience, and as in kidnapping other sorts of important human emotional experiences. And the very same thing happens with the fixation. So the fixation is a very limited worldview and view of who I am in this world that occupies a big part of the head center. When we say that human beings, according to research, use a very limited fraction of the brain's capacity, what the Enneagram is saying is that one of the reasons for that is that we're stuck on our fixations, and therefore we think only in certain ways and we avoid thinking in other ways. So we use less neuron connections, we use less of the brain's capacity. And if we want to evolve, we need to use more of those centers, all centers really, and not use them as in underuse or overuse, not kidnapping energy of other centers, but very importantly, not allowing these central manifestations of type occupy all the space within those centers, meaning not allow the fixation to take over the whole mental experience. And this is why I think Ichazo was brilliant when he came up with objective words and concepts about the passions and the fixations for each type. And at CP Enneagram, we try to respect the pioneering work that has been done either by Chasso or Naranjo or earlier on Gurdjieff, to really understand what they meant, because there was wisdom coming through them to convey those messages, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and there is more to say. I don't know if you want to add anything
Right.
to this first.
So I think on the one hand, to summarize, it's important not to get stuck overusing one center. That's a little bit of a different topic. The centers, how we want to balance the centers. We want to come from, we want to be able to do head work with the head, emotional work with the heart, and body work with the body, and do life in some ways being able to access all three centers. But talking a little more about the mental center, we also want to make sure that the fixation of the type, this kind of core sort of worldview, set of beliefs, idea about how things work and what our role is, we need to let that not be too limited and control what we think or the ways we use our head center, to make sense of the world, to analyze what's happening, just to think. Because then, in a way, our thinking is too narrow, and it's too rigidly guided by a by definition, a kind of narrow view of what's true about the world and our place in it and what we need to do to navigate in the world mentally.
Exactly. And the thing is, both the passion and the fixation in their respective centers of intelligence, they come from sorts of certainties that we create given our particular personalities.
Yeah.
Like, there is no other way of living life.
Right.
That's the assumption behind them. And we get really neurotic about them. When it comes to the fixation, it's like, this is how the world works, and I cannot not have this role in life.
It's kind of like an unquestioned
Yeah,
assumption about how the world works, or belief.
yeah.
And when we talk about fixation, I always can't help thinking about what I learned when I was training as a psychotherapist about cognitive behavioral work. Because cognitive behavioral therapy is probably an approach to therapy, psychotherapy, that many people are familiar with.
And in my view, not for emotions.
Yeah, and my understanding of it and appraisal of it when I was learning it in school, and I learned many different approaches to psychotherapy, but that was one of them, was that it, even though it's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and most cognitive behavioral therapists will say that they address the mental level, the emotional level, and the behavioral level, and the way all three work together. My experience of it was that it focused more on the mental.
Yeah.
Now, again, I've read different approaches to cognitive behavioral therapy, and they do discuss emotions, absolutely, but they stress a little bit more the cognitive. And what they do in cognitive behavioral therapy that I think is good is something that can help us understand the fixation, which is, they, of course, many CBT therapists aren't familiar with the Enneagram, and what they might do is help a person understand what are kind of some core guiding beliefs that you have about the world, that really shape the way you think about things, the assumptions you make about everything you experience in life, but that also kind of represent a narrative set of beliefs, some of which are often false.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So if someone, for instance, has a false belief about themselves, that they're not good enough, or that they'll never be successful, that belief will shape a lot of what happens to them, because our beliefs are very powerful indicators of what we view as possible, and sometimes what we allow to be possible, or because what we focus on, what we believe, in some ways can shape our reality. So when we talk about the fixation, I often think about what I learned in cognitive behavioral therapy and studying that approach. So I just thought I'd name that because I
Mhm.
think if people are familiar with that, that may also help them understand the
Yeah.
fixation. And I think it's related to the way that we define the fixation.
Yeah, and some other approaches I would add as potentially good ones to work on the fixation are NLP, hypnosis, transactional analysis, and some other kinds of therapies that address our thought forms. And I want to say that from the perspective of spiritual work and not only psychological work, we need to get rid of all forms of identification, and that
Mhm.
includes any sort of beliefs.
Yes, and just to define NLP, some people may not know what that is. It's neuro linguistic programming, and it's a very, very fully articulated approach to sort of how our neuro linguistic experience of life is programmed and how it operates in the brain. And it's a more mental approach to understanding ourselves, and it's been often combined with the Enneagram as well. So I think that is
Yeah,
a
but
good thing to mention.
at CP, we advocate that certain therapies are better for each thing. And
Right,
definitely, we need different approaches when it comes
right,
to working on the passion and the fixation.
right.
Anyway, back to definition of fixations. It's a limited belief. It's also a very narrow view of reality
Mhm,
with a consequence of a narrow view of who I should be in the world.
mhm,
But it's also a cognitive bias or like a cognitive mistake that we all make, one for different for each enneagram type.
mhm,
And again, the passion and the fixation are perhaps the two main things that everybody of that type share as a common denominator.
mhm,
And it's super important to understand that what defines being a person of that type are these two things
right.
ultimately. And the fixation um, is something that is more important than the passion, in my view, to define our identity, our roles in the world, and also our attention patterns,
Mhm,
how we focus attention, because that's more connected to the head center
mhm,
actually, and who we will be in the world.
mhm,
And from a perspective of ego development or personality development, what happens is that fixation is underneath the passion. It comes first, so to say, when we are, uh, as we should archetypally, developing our personality, making it a sound thing, potentially to deconstruct it later on. But the thing is, when we are doing inner work, we need to work on both, but a little bit more like passion first, fixation next. And most people don't get to any of those,
mhm,
but many Enneagram students get to working on the passion, but forget about the fixation.
mhm,
And one of the main reasons is we don't talk much about this.
mhm,
So this is why at CP we give a lot of focus on that from a certain moment on in our retreats. And I just
mhm,
want to mention, take the opportunity to mention that given that all of this is very intimately connected to the study and the work on the centers of intelligence, we are going to do later this year, 2023, for the first time ever, an online workshop on the centers, and it will be the opportunity for us to talk first time about a few things, as in Gurdjieffian approach to centers and how to actually work on that. So even for more senior students of ours, we are suggesting that this can be a good opportunity, but also for beginners.
Okay, so should we talk about the fixations of the nine types?
Yeah, okay, and then we may add a few more pieces that are general as we go.
Sure.
We always start with 8
Right.
and go clockwise on the Enneagram circle.
Right, right. So why don't you start talking about the fixation of type 8, and then I'll add
Yeah, yeah,
anything
yeah.
that
Okay.
occurs to me.
Right. So the fixation for eights is called vengeance. And what is it? It's a constant thought that there needs to be payback for everything people do or whatever happens in life. And I am the one observing that that should happen and waiting for that moment for to happen. So fixations do not need to be behaviors, and they do not need to be voiced out loud. Eights many times do because of their nature of speaking out, of being more
Being
transparent,
direct.
direct. But even for eights, vengeance is not easily seen at times.
Yeah.
So what vengeance is a mindset, and fixations are mindsets, a mindset of waiting or wishing for something to happen with the other person when I think that the person did something wrong, inadequate,
Yeah.
unfair. So sometimes I say things, sometimes I just go against, and with at least as much energy as I thought the person had, usually with more energy. But many times I'm just waiting to see when there will be payback. And then there will be that moment of some degree of pleasure when that happens with the other person.
Or satisfaction.
Satisfied. There is that word in German. What is it again?
Schadenfreude?
Yeah, can you explain it?
I'm not sure how this relates, but Schadenfreude is pleasure at other people's misfortune.
I think that relates directly with vengeance. Vengeance is a mindset that when that happens, I find pleasure because in my mind, it's the right thing happening at last.
It's like you were waiting for justice to be done.
Yeah, but it's my own justice.
Right.
So fixation is, as I said, the role I play in life. So it's on me to make sure that there will be this payback.
Right, because eights sometimes confuse their truth with the larger objective truth, or they may confuse their own sense of justice with a kind of larger divine justice.
Right.
Not thinking of it that way, of course, but they may sort of sense like this was the wrong thing, it needs to be addressed, and I'm the one to do it, or the way I think it should be done is the way it should be done.
Right, correct. And what I'm also pointing out is that all 9 fixations are very personal ways to understand what needs to happen in life. And therefore, they are 9 different ways of playing God.
Yeah.
Like God knows infinitely better, and I can just trust the process. And who am I to try to restore something or even think that something has been lost? And who am I to play a role that is actually something that should remain being a role for the divine, right? So vengeance goes that way as all other fixations do. But vengeance is, I remember a friend of mine, Nate, saying, I'm so much better, Uranio. I don't say things anymore when something happens. One of these days, someone went in front of me on a line, and I didn't say anything. And I asked, and did you think of anything? And she said, oh, yeah, I did think of there will be divine justice. So it's almost like I'm trying to remind God that he needs to do, or they need to do something about it. As in, I am God's assistant here on earth to make sure that creation is going as it should. So there is a lot of arrogance underneath the fixation, because arrogance is also a little more a manifestation of the head center than a manifestation of the other centers.
Right. Right. And I think there's also even ways that eights hold themselves back as like vengeance against people who have done them wrong. Like my parents never did a particular thing for me, so I'm not going to do that in my life almost as a way to get back at them. I'm going to hold myself back.
And fixations don't have any quality control department. So eights can have vengeance when they decide not to be happy because their parents did things to them, and it's almost like revenge to the parents and to God. Like, see what you did to me now. This is going to happen. I'll never smile again. Although that might be the opposite for many eights.
But it's like, drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, as we say.
Exactly. So it's a constant mindset. The same way that the passion becomes a totally dominating emotion, and again, it's the only one that should be called passion. The other ones are just emotions. There is only one fixation, one very particular fixation for each type. There might be other deeply entrenched paradigms that we need to work on, but they are not of the same level as the fixation is. It's more defining in the head center.
Okay.
Should we move on to 9?
Yes.
Or do you want to add anything about 8?
No, let's move on to 9.
Okay, so fixation for 9s is called indolence, and that is a fixed and limiting belief that I'm less.
And less important.
Yeah, but not only less important. I need to have less of a voice. I need to occupy less space. I need to show off less. I think it's.
But I thought that all comes from I'm not as important as others. Indolence is it's almost like a giving up on or a resignation about one's own importance in the world.
I'll allow myself to disagree to an extent with what you're saying, because I think it's not only about own importance, because that to me connects more to a feeling of being less important. To me, it's more of a mindset of, for instance, I need to be humble. I need to be humble as a value. It's not, and they criticize people who are not humble or showing off. So what I'm talking about is that when you see a 9 being modest or not showing off, please stop positioning that as a good thing or a virtuous behavior. Right. So I don't think it's only like thinking or feeling that I'm less important. It's like the world should be lived with everybody taking less space and being less. I don't think fixation is personal, like in the sense of it being only for myself. It's also like a worldview of how everybody should be, and we are trying to standardize people with a fixation. So it's a new hypothesis that I'm just sharing here for us to reflect more on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think of the way 9s sort of express indolence, or the way they think about it, or the way it manifests in their thinking, is a kind of sense. It's like an automatic assumption. Like, I had a client once who really believed that she was more boring than other people.
Yeah.
Like, she'd go to a party and she'd feel insecure because other people would rather talk to people who are more interesting than I am, So it's almost this assumption that I'm not as interesting, I'm not as, compelling, I don't have as much going on, I'm not as important. And then I think there's an automatic way that they kind of take a back seat. They don't express themselves. They don't lean into proactively speaking out, because this sense of indolence. It sort of makes them continually make the decision to not put themselves forward.
Yeah. So all of that to me is correct, and I agree. But so what I'm advocating for here is that the fixation is more than how I see myself. It's also how I see the world should be. And therefore, for 9s, if you allow me, there's a mistake that people make about 9s. People think that 9s are just understanding. And if you talk to more self-aware 9s, they will say, don't take my word for it. I'm very judgmental. And as body types, 9s are as judgmental as 1s and 8s. It's just that they hide that. So the part that is more seeable is that they make themselves less. But what happens all the time also inside the nine person, but it's not, they don't talk about that as much, is that they are very critical of other people. They might forget about that, but they keep being critical. And therefore the nine goes, I will show this person how they should be in the world. Like, I hate people who show off, and I won't show off, and I'll keep criticizing that person in my head because of the indolence as something. And then the world justifies that, like saying that humility is important, although to me that's not humility
Yeah,
at
it's
all.
interesting because what you're saying sounds like it has a little more emotion in it than what I'm talking about.
I
Like
don't
for
think
instance,
so.
when
I
you
don't.
think about a value that should be applied to everyone, I think that values often have a connection to feelings.
I don't agree with that. I think that it comes a lot from a mental construct of how people should be. It's a very fixed belief that people need to be modest. Period.
Hmm.
And then, as a body type, that connects to a
Mhm.
body based thing. And I do think that there are values that come from the body and not from the heart. Like, for instance, honor or loyalty, it doesn't come from the heart, it comes from the belly. And those are values. So, interesting discussions here,
Mm.
perhaps for another
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
But anyway, the most important thing, and I agree with you,
Mhm.
behind indolence is making myself less, is
Mhm.
making myself less than, but
Mhm.
mainly less in general when it
Mhm.
comes to the world. There
Mhm.
isn't much comparison here, for nines, and they are not dramatic about it like fours or social four, for instance, could be. And the thing is, for fours, it's not only a mental process. And for nines, indolence is mental, it's a belief. And
Mhm.
to deconstruct that, if you're a therapist or a coach, do not go to the emotions, connect that, because it won't work. It needs to be a mental approach to help the person. And if you are a nine, make sure that you work on your beliefs, your assumptions of how people should be, and mainly who you are. And this is why we also we highly suggest that to work on the fixation, people use things like affirmations. Affirmations, to be very honest, I don't like them for the work on the heart, emotional work, but it's brilliant for the work on the head.
And I think they don't work when you're using them for emotions.
Right.
I
So,
think they're more going against certain beliefs. It's like
yeah.
challenging beliefs and really looking at the opposite and how the opposite is more true.
Yeah, and I like to say that the best affirmations to go against the fixation are fixations that puzzle our normal ways of thinking.
You mean thoughts that,
Thoughts,
yeah.
yes. So, for instance, for nines, an affirmation like, you are, you know, depriving the world from seeing who you are, or from having your contribution, and you are,
Of, yeah.
yeah, of that. And you are also not showing the reality that you're very big and capable.
Right, right.
So
Yeah, and you're not putting something in the world that may be very necessary for things to move forward or for
yeah,
things certain things to happen.
right. So you're not doing your role, you're not
Yeah,
accomplishing your mission,
right.
right? So affirmations that,
Not providing something needed.
yeah, and even if they are more positive, they are better. Like,
Yeah.
you can play a bigger role,
Right. And also because some of the fixations often generate a lot of false beliefs about what's true, and um, being really clear about what those false beliefs are, bringing them out into the light helps you disidentify from them. And going against them can help go against them even more.
yeah,
Like really seeing the affirmation in your mind or repeating it to yourself can be something very helpful.
right. And So I also want to mention, not only for indolence, but for all fixations, that NLP talks about neurological levels connected to thoughts. So the first one being behaviors. So we need to start working on behaviors when we work on fixations. But then later on, you have values and then identity and even like mission later on. Although I think that mission goes way beyond, even the role of fixations.
Mm-hmm.
But should we go on and talk about ones?
Yes, let's talk about ones.
So resentment is
Mm-hmm.
the fixation.
Yeah.
And it's super useful for you, if you're a one, to understand that before you engage with anger inside you, you have a constant thought that things are not right, and that is insistent. Like when you're driving and you try to see people doing the wrong thing, or you pay attention to that, or in the parking lot, someone who haven't parked the car correctly, or at work or at home, or when you yourself don't do something correctly. So before it becomes a very harsh emotional process with the inner critic, it starts with thoughts that things are basically wrong, being badly done, not following rules. So it's a concept, for instance, that we should always follow rules. And sometimes without acknowledging that, it's like as many as possible, like as many rules as necessary, even if ones don't own this aspect
Or the
of
rules
that.
that they believe should be followed.
Right, because it's, again, the fixation is a very arrogant form of thinking that we know better.
For all types.
All types, not ones only. So it's a constant resentment to see that my brother, my sister come home and they don't do homework, they go play first, and I don't. So I need to carry the load, other people don't. But that is a thought before it becomes an emotion. So if you want to heal that, you need to work on that thought pattern. And you need also to pay attention to other things. If you spend your whole life as a one paying attention only to errors, mistakes, or what's wrong, then you'll never solve the main issue.
Right.
And resentment, therefore, is something that produces a similar thing that what happens with force, which is noticing what's missing here, but more in the sense of not looking at the past or the future, but more like in the present or the immediate next moment, what I believe should be the right thing. And then, as all body types, a belief that there is only one right way.
Right. And it might not be noticing what's missing. It might be noticing what isn't missing, but that's there and wrong. It's whatever goes against the one sense of right and wrong, good and bad, what should be happening versus what is happening. So it's a kind of mental appraisal of things that aren't right, and noticing that and identifying that, and maybe even mentally comparing what others are doing to what I think should be done.
Right. Yeah. Should we move on to the heart types and starting with choose?
Sure.
Okay. So for two, the fixation is called flattery in English. But I want to start by saying that Oscar Ichazo, as a South American, a Bolivian man, he created all of this in Spanish first.
Right.
And the word in Spanish was adulación, or in Portuguese, my mother language, adulação. And there is a word, I believe, in English called adulation.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
that might be even more of a correct word, but let's stick with the more traditional names, flattery. But let's also make sure that flattery is something that is well understood and not labeled incorrectly.
Right.
So flattery as a fixation for choose is a thought that I can make people like me,
Mm-hmm.
or I can drive the image I'll have with people, and I'll seduce anybody, actually, and I can manage all of that, and
Mm-hmm.
everybody else can. Why don't
Mm-hmm.
they?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
After that, it becomes pride.
Mm-hmm.
But first, it starts with a thought
Mm-hmm.
that is doable and that is needed.
Mm-hmm.
So the fixation is like, why don't all other people see that that is the best way to live life?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that is behind the fixation. But flattery is also the mental strategy of being nice,
Mm-hmm.
and the mental strategy of adapting and shape-shifting. So if I want to be friends with someone, I will um, I will start liking what that person likes. And why not?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Coming from flattery, the two not only doesn't see a problem with that,
Mm-hmm.
because later it leads to, not being in touch with my own needs,
Mm-hmm.
but also they think that that is the way to do relationships. And another thing about flattery is what is sometimes called manipulation for Jews. It comes from what we are explaining. Like, I adapt and I make other people feel certain things about me, but also the mindset here is the reciprocity mindset. So choose sometimes without knowing, and this is highly unconscious for all types also, they they have they're accountants. Naturally they are born being accountants. Like, I do this and you should do that, and then we'll have reciprocity.
Interpersonal accountants,
Yes.
not money
Oh,
accountants.
no, no,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
no. And that is, I'll calculate what's fair. I do this for you, and you do this for me. Although I don't ask, so that doesn't happen, and later on I get resentful. But it starts with a mindset that there needs to be fairness in the relationship.
yeah. I mean, I think that's getting farther afield. This is
Mm-hmm.
just, and again, you
Yeah,
may not agree, but I think I think you're right that that leads to that sense of reciprocity. But adulation, flattery itself, to me, I think that's an expanded version of it.
but I
I
do
think
think it's a belief, that life should be like that, and relationships need to be fair.
right. And again, I think it's the idea that for me as a two, it's the idea that this is what I think can be most problematic about the fixation as a belief or a worldview. It's the idea that I can control how other people think and feel about
Yeah,
me.
the first thing I said. Yeah, okay.
It's the if I'm the way I behave, the things I say, the way I relate to someone has the power to shape how that person thinks about me and how they feel about me.
Yeah.
And for me, that's and again, of course, all of these things, it can't be said often enough, and maybe we haven't said it enough in terms of how much we say it about the passion, but these things operate very automatically and unconsciously.
Mm.
So they're sort of unconscious and often unacknowledged beliefs about how the world works or what's true or what I need to do all the time to be okay or maintain my whole personality pattern. And I think for me, the flattery is I have the power to shape how you think and feel about me by the things I say to you, by the way I relate to you. So it's like if I'm nice to you, some people think flattery is giving compliments, and it can be. That's one big sort of category of flattery. That feels a little like I notice about myself, I don't give compliments that much. I think it's because I'm a little more shy or something, and compliments sometimes seem, I don't know, too overt or something or obvious, but I do think I see it in the way I treat someone or the things I say or I don't say,
Mm.
agreeing with someone, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even when in my heart of hearts I don't agree with that
Mm-hmm.
person, I will agree in the moment to create more of a positive impression.
Right.
But I even think it's the illusion that with the things I say and do and how I relate to you, I control how you feel about me and what you think about me.
Right. But then, I do think that it's part of the fixation, the strategy to come across as being a nice person.
Yeah.
And I think that is many times nonverbal, like the way I look at the person, a smile that I use at the right moment when I approach the person. I move my palms, towards the person, as in being receptive and welcoming. And the first thing I'll say. So one thing I want to stress here, two actually. I think the giving to get comes from the fixation more than the passion here, the flattery more than pride.
So I have a question about that, because when I think about giving to get, a big part of that for me comes from not either being aware of what I need or not being able to ask for what I need, which seems very related to pride.
Mhm.
Pride is a kind of blind spot around that I have needs of other people, and that I should, like, when I ask for a need for someone else, is something a little bit humbling in that, because you're sort of saying, putting yourself in the position of vulnerability with regard to that person. So in terms of pride, giving to get seems a little bit more connected to pride, because it's a sense of, I'm giving things to you so I don't have to ask for what I need. And so you think, so you have this positive inflated view or feeling about me. And I'm hoping you give back to me so I don't have to ask you for what I need, which is pride.
Mhm.
So that's where, again, I wonder if, and again, I think this can be an ongoing
Yeah.
discussion. I'm not saying I'm right and you're wrong. I'm saying, when you say that, I wonder, because to me, the fixation is really about all the things I say, do, and don't do to to make you. And when I say make you, again, I'm playing God here. I make you feel as and view me a certain way, feel about me a certain way, view me a certain way. And it's the power I think I have to do that successfully by all these things I do that, to me, is the essence of flattery. Like, for instance, I had a psychotherapy client once who's a two, and when I introduced the idea at one point that she didn't necessarily have the power to control the feelings of her family members, she was shocked,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like, well, no, I have to do this and do that so they feel good,
So
right?
even in what you're saying,
Yeah.
you're talking about a mental approach you had with this client, like
Yes,
a new thought, a new
absolutely.
idea. So
Absolutely.
so
That's why I think it's the fixation, that part.
okay. So look, I agree fully with you that it's a very interesting, rich discussion and ongoing, a work in progress. And I think that as a Jew, you obviously have more to add about flattery than I do. And yet, I think also that I wonder if for choose it's even a bit harder to see the effect of the thoughts underneath the emotions because they are more emotional. And I believe that for all of us on the Enneagram field, we have been doing less work on the head center than on the heart center. People who are committed to inner work. So my thing here is just to mention the second thing I was going to say. Shape shifting for choose comes from the fixation of flattery, in my view, and it's more strategized. It's many times sort of unconscious, but it's still done by using the head. And so the chameleon like aspect of choose to me comes from flattery and not pride mostly. Of course, all of that gets mashed up and it ends up being on both. But the thing to me is, as a good five, I need to know where the process starts to attack the cause, the
Right,
root
right, right,
cause, right?
right.
But just to finish, um, as opposed to threes, for whom the chameleon thing and the excessive adaptation happens in the heart. So it's very different for twos and threes when it comes to where it starts, the adaptability, the excessive adaptability start. For twos, in my view, it starts in the head. For threes, it starts in the heart. And therefore, the ways to work on those things are different.
Yeah, and that I can agree with more. That the shape shifting, the strategizing to appear a certain way, to create a certain impression, or to align with someone, or to make them feel a certain way about you. that can go more under the category of flattery. And I think because I have worked a lot, like, when I first started working on myself as a two, I wasn't completely in touch with my emotions. I didn't always know how to name them. I got overwhelmed by them, and it took a lot of work to get clear about my emotions, what was coming from where. And so now I think I've, again, I think I'm not so clear about all the fixations because they're not, I don't, they're not, I'm not inside those other types, but I think that there's a way that I've gotten better at
Oh yeah.
separating what comes from the mental and what comes from the emotional for me as a two.
Mhm. Let's move on to threes.
Let's do.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, so start. So the fixation of threes is
Vanity.
vanity.
So this is the original concept by Oscar Ichazo. And me personally, I I like to wait way more to change what the original people have built as their theory, and I don't think it's the best choice for the whole Enneagram community that each teacher comes up with different names and review the concepts, because also we end up lacking a common terminology that creates a lot of confusion out there for students. So we stick with Oscar Ichazo's original thing that says that vanity is the fixation while self-deceit is the passion.
Right. And just for history, Claudio Naranjo, I would say Claudio Naranjo didn't change very many things from Echazo. I think he gives Echazo a lot of credit for all that he teaches about the Enneagram. I think this was one of the, like, maybe one or two things that he changed from Echazo's original teaching.
Yeah.
And so at a certain point, many years into his development of his Enneagram understandings and his articulation of the types, Claudio Naranjo changed the original Oscar Ichazo, that the passion is self-deceit and the fixation is vanity. Claudio Naranjo switched them.
I know.
So in many, no, I'm claiming for everybody
Yeah,
else, not for
yes,
you.
I know.
So because many people probably don't, we get this question all the time and people don't understand it. So if we're talking about this, I think we need to spell it all out so people get the whole story. So Naranjo at a certain point, I think in the 90s actually, switched them and said
Which was
that in his
over
view,
20 years later.
in his view, vanity was the passion and self-deceit was more mental. So that was his assessment on what he had seen. And then Riso and Hudson followed suit. So so when you hear Russ Hudson talk about the passions and the fixations, you'll hear him say this latter day Naranjo view, whereas what we're expressing is that self-deceit is the passion and vanity is the fixation.
Yeah,
so we'll talk about vanity from that point of
although
view.
I believe that Don and Russ got to this conclusion themselves without the influence of Naranjo, and only later on at a conference, actually, they had a talk with Naranjo and realized that they had the same view. But with all due respect, I disagree with them both, because here's the thing: the passion is always the opposite of the virtue, and the fixation is always the opposite or the flip side of the coin of the holy ideas. And there's no doubt whatsoever in the Enneagram community that veracity is a virtue for threes, and that hope, holy hope, is the holy idea for threes among three holy ideas associated to that type. So, what is the opposite of veracity? Veracity being a little bit like the heart wishing to be only what it is, right? Being very true to just being and being me.
A kind of truth felt in the heart.
What is the opposite of that? The opposite is self-deceit, when I shapeshift and become everything else, right? That is the opposite, and therefore that's the passion. But the fixation here of vanity is a little bit in the right concept of what vanity is the opposite of the holy idea of hope. Like in hope, everything will turn out okay and everything will be all right regardless of what I do or what I don't do. So vanity, in my understanding, is a thought that I am more central to make things happen that I actually am. Like when threes think, I cannot be absent of work because nothing will happen. And also the thought that if I'm not doing my hard work, everything will collapse. Nothing will go right. It's like a very vain, or in the past, vainglory way of seeing my importance in the world. But before it becomes something that makes me puff up my chest, it is just a thought that I cannot stop, and that I need to work very hard all the time, and that I need to know everything that's happening, and I need to keep a central position. And it's not as much something that is driven for me in the beginning, for me to be number one. It's more like I need to make sure that the world will not collapse. And there is the vanity behind that, of thinking of myself very highly as being more capable than. And that is the main concept of vanity. Although there are other aspects that are closer to a modern understanding of what vanity is. And maybe you can add those.
Right. Yeah. I think every time you define vanity, I have a little bit of a difference because while I don't disagree with what you're saying, I think what your definition lacks is some consciousness of living for the eyes of others, is appearance.
Yeah.
Like people are looking at me, right? And I think when you describe what you describe, it sounds a little more like pride. And because what's missing is the vanity, is this sense of everybody's looking to me. So I agree with that sense of being central. Like if I don't do things, it won't happen, but not without some sense of everybody's looking to me. And there needs to be some sense of image or appearance included in that, because this is not in isolation, like if nobody else was around, then maybe it wouldn't be the same. I think that there's a constant consciousness of how I look to other people that's part of this mental sense of vanity. And I think that's in the dictionary definition of vanity, and I think it's also in the Enneagram definition of vanity, that I'm constantly referring to how I am in the eyes of others and how I look to the eyes of others. And part of that is just how I'm appearing, and that I need to appear the right way, so that others see me in this way, and that I am important in making everything function as well. But I think there's that image sense that I think really that's just a central part of the definition of
Right. And
vanity.
I agree, it's both,
Yeah, but
in
you
my
usually
view.
don't say that part.
Yeah, because I think the first one is the one that is missing in the general understanding in the Enneagram community. And this is why I emphasize that more. And I believe that what you're explaining is right as a second thing for vanity. And it's important for threes to understand that it starts as a concept and not as an emotional need to be the one. And by the way, my experience with threes, even in the past, I had a business partner who's a three for many years, over 10 years, is that threes value things like personal marketing, personal image, not only for themselves, but as the right thing to do. And they go teach others at times. It depends on subtype also, how that is important and how that should be done, which is, find out that this is the way to live life and how important that is. Please follow what I'm seeing and you're not. That's my point here. But anyway, I think again that it's such an interesting and important discussion we are bringing up here, and hopefully now that the platforms like Apple Podcast and Spotify, they allow people to comment on the episodes, I'm hoping that people can leave some comments of their own, hopefully for their own type.
Sure, sure. Okay, so should we talk about type 4?
Yeah, and the fixation there is melancholy. um, And melancholy is a thought that something's missing, a thought that I need to think of that thing that's missing, and that therefore I need to remember the past, or I need to idealize the future. It starts as a very rational thing, but then pretty soon, for a very emotional type, it becomes, suffering, pain, and like nostalgia, or an emotional idealization. But it starts in the very, very beginning of the process as a thought. And this is what I really want to emphasize. If force want to truly change, it's not enough to do only the work on those all those emotions. They need to change the ways that they think. And I've heard from many fours that if there's nothing they're suffering with, they will go find it, something to suffer with, thinking of something of the past that they don't have right now. Like I heard a four say once that the person was in this beautiful trip where nothing wrong was happening at a beach place, and then all of a sudden that person started thinking of a wonderful trip of the past to the mountains. So there are no mountains here, although there is nothing really missing right now on this beach trip. So it's like a focus on what's missing that comes from a concept that I cannot just pay attention to what's present.
Right. And I guess the only thing I would say is it seems to me like an automatic tendency to mentally notice what's missing. It's
Yes,
like a
yes.
mental analysis of what's happening and a recognition of this is what's missing here. Oh, here's what's missing here. There's something in the way you phrase it. It might be the English that I don't think it's a thinking about what's missing. I think it's an automatic noticing of what's
Yeah,
missing.
which actually I think it's also part of the definition of the fixation. Like we pay attention to that way more than to other things, and it's not because it's related to a thought that it's a slow process. It's very automatic for all of us, but it's related to our placement of attention. I keep placing attention to one specific thing. For force, it's paying attention to what's missing, and then it comes very automatic to
Right.
me. So there is mechanicity or automatism underneath the
Yeah. It's
fixation.
like an automatic tendency that's always happening. It's not something we have to think to do.
Yeah.
It's just always it's generating. I think one of the things that may be confusing for people, and I have mentioned this to you before, but I think it's important to say that may be confusing with people about like what your main point is, making sure we recognize the fixation is mental and the passion is emotional. Is I'm not sure about this, but I think in English at least, the word melancholy is an emotion. Like, in other words, the word melancholy means an emotion, whereas I agree with you that in Enneagram terms, the fixation is melancholy, and melancholy is a mental kind of appraisal of what's missing. But I do think I just kind of want to mention that may be part of what leads to, especially like you say, with a four who is emotion centered, what might be confusing sometimes. And so maybe it's just important for us to acknowledge that the word melancholy can refer to an emotion generally, but in Enneagram terms, it refers to this mental habit of seeing what's missing.
Yeah, I think that while Lichasso was very accurate in the concepts of what the fixations were, he was not necessarily, uh, the didn't necessarily choose the best words for the fixations,
Right.
and yet I think it's very difficult to find
Yes.
one word to describe what we are describing,
Yes.
and I don't like changing the
Yeah.
original terminology because I don't think it's the best service to the whole
And
community.
I think often we can't find a better
Yeah,
word. And even if we think that we can, sometimes it's not really.
right.
It's
Yeah,
not really that big of an improvement. When I've seen people try to improve the existing words, I often think, well, that word has a different problem. It's not necessarily better. So it's better to kind of acknowledge that words are often imperfect descriptions of some of the experiences we're trying to convey.
right.
Okay, so let's talk about type 5 and the
Yay,
fixation of type
finally!
5.
Yay!
Yes, the moment you've been waiting for.
Not really, because it's always a bad thing to talk about the fixation, and it's stinginess for my type, type
Yes.
5.
Yes.
And what that is, it's not stinginess with money necessarily, although it can be, but that's very limiting to think
Right.
it's
It's
only
not
this.
just about something like money. It's more broad than that.
It's way broader because it's stinginess with everything.
Yeah.
It's like all types of resources.
Yeah.
So stinginess with my time to people, stinginess with energy that I'll spend with people, stinginess with my territory, my belongings at times, even some abstract ones that it's what I have with me, my thoughts, and stinginess in general. So it's a mindset of always calculating how much energy I have
Mhm.
as a 5. And it's like having that battery icon as in our laptops, that goes lower and lower and lower, and that's what 5s have intrinsically inside their heads.
Yes.
And it feels like it's always running low, and I can't use the battery to an unexpected surprise and demand request or even expectation from someone else. And therefore I need to plan for very efficient ways of going about in life, and living life without spending as much energy, which leads to even small things in life, like the route I'll get to spend less energy if I'm walking, gas if I'm driving, and the more efficient way to get to a place. It is somehow based in stinginess, and it's a thought that energy is limited. And then, as for all fixations, it's good to have affirmations like there are no limits, for someone like a 5, or to study things like when athletes get to what they call the zone, like after a lot of energy
Expenditure.
expenditure, they get to this place that they are lacking energy, but then poof, what happens is a lot of energy.
They get a second wind, as we call it.
Yeah,
Fives
so
don't believe in a second wind.
yeah, so getting on the zone, and but 5s can appreciate new concepts, and that they can get there, and that would be a great one to work on stinginess. But it's very hard, because as for all fixations, it's a very deeply rooted belief that leads to experiencing life like that, right? So it's hard not to live life based on that. It's a constant thought and mindset, or even an implicit assumption, which is another
Yes.
thing that the fixations are.
Yeah, I remember one time in therapy, my therapist said to me, he was referring to like a really core belief I had. He said, it's almost like a religious conviction.
Mm-hmm.
Like you hold this so strongly. And it's like all of us, what the fixation is for all of us. I think with 5s, it's like this total belief in this mindset of scarcity. It's hard to challenge because there is this sense of I only have this much energy, I only have this much space, and this kind of fierceness in guarding that against depletion by others or by experience or by life, what happens. And so again, like all our beliefs, when we firmly are committed to them, it's like they determine our experience, and
Mm-hmm.
then our experience kind of feeds the belief, so it
Yeah.
can be this kind of feedback mechanism. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that that all of us types have this, and for 5s it looks like I only have enough energy, and oh, I expended this talking to this person or having this emotional experience with someone, and now I feel tired and depleted, and that feeling is kind of real, but it's based on this belief. It's
Right.
almost like the expectation is set, and that expectation and that belief in scarcity contributes a little bit to the experience, and the belief that, oh, now I must be tired, or now I have no energy, or I need to avoid that situation again. And that it's this sense of stinginess around, and guardedness around all kinds of things, that and makes the five less generous than I think in their hearts they
Right.
often really are.
And this is the thing I was going to point out too. It's stinginess is lack of generosity.
Yeah.
Although, some people say, oh no, fives are very generous, because like they can explain things to you very patiently, or they can even be good confidants.
Or maybe they give you some of your time even though they really don't want to.
Well, many times fives give you time, willingly. But the thing is, they want to learn something about it. They are finding it
Or
interesting,
there's a limit to it
or
also.
I have planned for that.
Yes.
It's like, there is a verb that I like to use to explain stinginess, and it's to budget.
Yeah.
Like if it's budgeted, like my time is reserved for that, it's okay. But if you come to me out of surprise or too repeatedly, it's
Or if things take
harder.
longer than
Yeah.
expected.
Yeah. So yeah, and I also want to say that just like passions, fixations are important for us to get out of our inner loops, like the vicious circles we create and find it so hard to get out of.
Mhm.
So we need to stop that thought, and we need to willingly stop that emotion so that we get out of the loop,
Mhm.
right? So because they are very persistent, both fixation and passion, we need to be courageous to stop them somehow, we forcefully even. But should we move on to cowardice for
Yes.
sixes?
Yes. Let's move on to type 6, and the fixation is cowardice.
Yeah, and I like this word because it shows how, fixations are not good. And they cowardice is I won't be. I won't be the one. And I will question, I'll doubt. And all the problems I have to become the authority or to unlock my power.
Right.
It's a lot what's behind or underneath
I'll
cowardice.
find a lot of reasons why to hold back from
Right.
being something, contributing more, um, moving forward in life, doing things, coming up with a lot of mental reasons or questions or doubts that end up holding me back, and that become good reasons for not doing something that I might do.
Right. Yes, perfect. And then cowardice comes to a belief that I need to ask questions. I need to doubt. I will get to more certainty only by seeing the negatives and the points that are, you know, I need to be concerned with. So cowardice is also the mental process of looking at the negatives in a way. And cowardice is, why not? Why not just going for it? Why needing to have certainty?
You mean that's the way to work against
Yes,
cowardice? Yeah.
yes. So that's a way to oppose cowardice or the fixation. Again, affirmations.
Right.
But the thing here is procrastination
Yeah, that's what
is
I was going
part
to
of
say.
cowardice.
Procrastinate, when sixes procrastinate, often it's cowardice that is
Right.
behind that,
So it's a
because
mindset. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, a mental analysis of, here are all the reasons why, I'm not ready, or
Hmm.
it's not time yet, or I'm not sure, or maybe the conditions aren't right.
Mm,
It's not heading out into unknown territory, for
right.
instance.
Yeah, and certainty is a myth, and then also because it doesn't exist in a world of
Right.
uncertainty,
Waiting to have enough information or
right?
to be certain, and
Or
that never
getting or
happens.
getting reassurance from someone outside. So actually, most of the issues with authority come from the fixation, in my view, more than from fear as the passion.
Hmm.
That's my, another hypothesis here among many.
Yeah,
that
I would want to say it's both.
Yeah.
That it can be either.
Yeah, my point is more like it's not that it's not both, it's where does it start so I can act more efficiently in that thing. But anyway, it's debatable.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I think that cowardice leads not only to procrastination, but also to a way of putting limits to what I can do in my inner work.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can do this, but I can't do that, and then I create a very long list of things that I need to work on, so that it's endless.
Mm-hmm.
So cowardice, and this is why we suggest that sixes shorten their timelines.
Mm-hmm. Right. Push themselves, because cowardice can hold them back forever. Yeah.
And then a very interesting one and very little understood: planning for sevens.
Right. Type 7, the fixation. For type 7, the fixation is planning.
Very little understood out there. So what is it? It's like, I like to explain it this way. As the opposite of the holy idea. What is the holy idea of holy plan? It's the fact that life, existence, God, they have a plan for us. And whatever is happening in our lives is the wisest thing that should be happening. It's the fastest way to get to inner realization if I really engage with that and with nothing else. And then sevens say, I don't agree with that. That's not a good idea. And there is a flaw in this holy plan here. And therefore, I need to come up with my own planning for my life.
Now, again, what you just said, I think, is behind it, but the way you said it makes it sound like this is more conscious than it is. So I just want to highlight that.
Yes.
It's not that the 7 is thinking that, like, oh, I don't trust holy plan, I'm going to come up with my own plan. It's a compulsion. It's an automatic tendency to constantly have this mental activity going where I'm figuring out what I'm going to do next and how I'm going to plan things so that I will have the experience that I want, so that I will have the pleasure that I want, so that I will avoid the things I want to avoid. And it's the illusion, again, the mental illusion that I can control everything and I can control my experience in a way that's positive, right? And just having that level of control is playing God. And so that's never positive. But it's this illusion that I need to be always thinking and planning everything out so that I can find the best option and control how I'm experiencing life moment to moment instead of just being in the present moment and being open to what comes. Because again, the 7s have this need to avoid, because they don't want to necessarily have experiences they don't want to have, that they believe will be too painful or too unpleasant or uncomfortable, etc.
Right, and thanks for the reminder that it's more automatic and more unconscious. Actually, it's important to think of fixations not as much as thoughts per se, but more as implicit assumptions.
Yes, yeah.
And then it doesn't take us much time to just think or rethink.
Exactly. It's almost like the mindset, the implicit mindset behind the way of thinking.
Or a bias.
Yeah, and that core beliefs kind of get generated out of, or assumptions about the way things are that guide our choices.
Right. But back to planning.
Yeah.
Planning makes sevens, try to guarantee beforehand that there will be good alternatives.
Yes.
Positive alternatives.
And that they'll have the power to always choose the best alternative according to what they think in their head.
Yes. So there will be flexibility. And therefore, there comes a very important thing for sevens, which is freedom. Right, I need to have the freedom of free choice, of going my own way, and don't put me in a straitjacket. But anything can feel like a straitjacket for sevens. And my point is that comes from planning. And later on, they get the additional help of gluttony as the passion to make sure that there are multiple alternatives. But planning is, I will have my own way of living my life, and don't mess up with that, and don't come limit me.
Yeah, I will find options and then have the ability to choose between them, and I will direct my experience in the ways that I want to, and that I have the power to always do that, and that that's the best course of action,
Right.
right? Because I think when sevens work on themselves and when they grow, what they realize is that planning is just an illusion and often gets thwarted by life, and it's often better for them to be open to what life is bringing and to flow with life. That can be more exciting, more enriching, etc., than when they're planning everything out. But of course, I think part of what these fixations are expressing is the defensive role of the personality
Yes.
that we
Yes.
identify with, this idea that this is what's going to keep me safe, this is what's going to, keep me in a sort of a positive experience of life, which of course is all just part of the ego's arrogance that it knows best.
Yeah, exactly. And also the thing here and behind planning, but for all fixations, is that by planning, I will make sure that everything will go right as in my vision of what is right.
Right.
So I will make sure that life will be good.
The personality's vision of what's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So what life should be
Yeah.
is behind planning.
Yeah.
So fixation is a way of denying or not fully believing in creation as it is. So
And in sort of the universal flow or Tao of life,
yes,
being
exactly.
the wisest flow.
Yeah, and the thing that sevens might want to bear in mind is that freedom is a fake thing in this way, because they get slaves to pleasure, they
Yeah.
get slaves
They
to
become
their
slaves.
own alternative and to
Yeah.
freedom itself.
Mm-hmm. Or
And
the concept of freedom.
and I like always to bring back, a vision of all of this from the essence perspective. And what is it? It's like, in
Sorry.
in essence, yeah, a
There's a
mosquito
bug.
here, yeah, interfering with our planning, yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing is that from an essence perspective, planning is, not really surrendering to life,
Right.
and life as it is,
Right.
not
And the present moment.
in the present moment, and to the one and only thing that's happening right now.
Right.
So the thing is, what if freedom is really becoming a slave to the plan of life for me,
Right.
and a slave to reality as it is, and not fantasy?
Right. Right.
Good. I think we have covered quite a bit of content
Me
here,
too.
although it's endless, and we've been working more and more on helping our students overcome their fixations in our retreats.
Yes. 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 A very important subject. We hope that you've gotten a clearer understanding of the fixation and what it is and how it shows up for the different types. But now it's time for our top five.
And what is our top five today, B?
Our top five today is the top five types most likely to become anarchists.
And let us say that anarchism here is a neutral concept that can have good things and not so good
So
things.
let's
So
define it. It's
please.
an absence of government, anarchy, a state of lawlessness or political disorder due to the absence of governmental authority. So an anarchist is basically someone who goes against kind of an established order, an authority, government sometimes, people who would prefer living in a state of no government.
Good.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Yeah, a person who rebels against any authority, established order, or ruling power. And I think it's an interesting concept. There are a lot of people out there who think things would be better.
Right. So we're talking actually about a political position above all here when it comes to anarchy, but also a way of living or
Yeah, it's a kind of a
wanting life
view
to
of,
be. Yeah.
yeah, a view of what would be best in society, even,
Mhm.
not,
Mm.
it has a political
You
flavor,
know,
of
in my
course.
youth, like when I was a teenager or even my early 20s, I was sort of an anarchist. It
Mm,
was my philosophy of
interesting.
life.
Interesting.
And then it changed, but
Hmm. Hmm.
not completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, what is your number five type in terms of the types most likely to be anarchists?
It's type 6.
Hmm.
I was prone to not include sixes on the list because to me they tend to need to have more rules and certainty, and anarchism might lead them to think it's chaos, although it's not
Mm,
necessarily chaos.
mhm,
But
mhm,
some sixes are not like that, especially I
mhm,
think sexual sixes,
mhm,
and maybe some particular instinctual sequences there.
mhm. Interesting. Interesting. Well, my number five is four,
Mm.
actually, because I think fours can be kind of nonconformists. I don't think they're the biggest anarchists, but I think they can often come up with sort of mental reasons why everybody being able to do their own thing would be good. They're idealists in certain ways, and sometimes that idealism can be about kind of nonconformity.
Right, and for the same reasons, this is my number four, type 4.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, I think they are contrarians to a good extent,
Mm-hmm.
and they go for what is not the most conventional thing and the status quo. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what
Mm-hmm.
is your number four?
So my number four, and I hesitated to put this on my list, but in the end I included it, is type eight.
Hmm.
Because I think there's a way that eights are kind of about order, and sometimes they can be that order or they can be the authority and who creates order. But I also think they can be very rebellious, and I
Mm.
think if they have a certain worldview that works against the established order, I think they can sort of throw their weight, their energy, their strength behind going against
Mm.
also. But I think they're not the most obvious to me, but in the end, I thought they were more than the other types.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I ended up not including eight on my list, but
Yeah,
I also contemplated it.
yeah.
um, because for me, eights are more like I don't like these rules, but I want to create my own. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway,
Exactly.
my number three is five,
Uh,
and I think it's mainly for one reason, that fives at times can just be very open and follow certain theories, and the main theories and theoreticians behind anarchism are quite interesting and very
mm-hmm,
articulate.
mm-hmm,
And I think that fives at times can just go on with theories, even if in practice they are not very easy to implement.
mm-hmm,
And I see many fives,
mm-hmm,
signing up for different
mm-hmm,
kinds of theories like that,
mm-hmm,
and also very specific forms of thinking the world.
mm-hmm,
So I think that was a little bit what led me in my earlier life
mm-hmm,
to follow anarchism,
mm-hmm,
and there is not as much necessarily grounding aspects of what we advocate for. Like
mm-hmm.
fives are not necessarily the most realistic
Not the most practical,
or
like
practical.
something that works more in theory, but not
Yeah,
necessarily in
and I
practice.
don't think it's all fives, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, for all the reasons you stated, five is. I also have five at my number three
Mm,
position,
mhm.
because I think again they can, and I think there are actually some writers out there who argue persuasively for positive things about anarchy. So yeah, I have five as my in my third position
Yeah,
also.
I do think that there might be more mental types, and there are tend to be anarchists. But
Yeah.
anyway, my number two is social repressed people.
Ah,
Sorry. Self-pres repressed people.
ah,
I
self-pres repressed. Ah,
because
right.
I think that they're bolder, they want to risk, and
Mm-hmm.
they are less prone to following routine, but also rules, more
Mm-hmm.
youthful,
Mm-hmm.
and more like let's give it a try to
Mm-hmm.
ideas that are less conventional and bold,
Mm-hmm.
ambitious, and not ambitious in I want to be, but in like
Um,
let's try the new.
I see. I see.
So
Yeah.
all 9 types when self-pres is
I
repressed.
see. I see. Very clever. So my number two is 7,
Mm. Mm.
because I think sevens are very mentally flexible and similar to fives, can get behind a good theory, and especially can want a lot of freedom, right? From anybody telling them what to do, which can look like no government is a good idea.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, to me, 7 is my number one by far. I
Uh,
see so many sevens that at least flirt with anarchism in
mhm.
practice,
Yeah,
like
I've seen that too.
friends,
Yeah,
people.
me too.
My dear son, who's a 7, is an
Yes,
anarchist, is now
yes,
23.
yes.
And I think that many sevens tend to go for that because they equalize authority, they don't like too many rules, and they are more like egalitarian, and they like options,
Yeah,
as we talked about when we described the fixation of planet.
yeah, yep.
So
Makes
I'm very
sense.
curious about your number
My
one.
number one is sexual 6.
Ah, okay,
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
Yeah,
Because the several of the anarchists I've known and the
yeah,
people who argue really forcefully for it are sexual 6s.
right.
I think there's a way they go against authority kind of in the extreme,
Hmm.
and that can often mean any kind of authority is bad authority. So,
Good point.
so yeah, that was mine. I also think other 6s, but the sexual 6 is really the main one. I think that I would put in that category.
Great, I like that.
Yes. Okay, so that does it for this episode. We want to thank you for listening to our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, and we hope you'll join us again where we talk about all things Enneagram.